down the costs. Just 2 years ago, if you look at solar PV, onshore wind, offshore wind, the prices would have been 6 cents for solar. That was regarded as an unachievable price. A lot of people thought at 6 cents, the developers are losing money on that project in UAE. Onshore wind, 4.5 cents. Offshore wind, 12 cents. And everybody was still talking about when will it be grid competitive. 2016, you're down to around 3 cents for solar and wind, 5 cents US per kilowatt hour for offshore wind. And today, the world record is under 2 cents for solar, 2 cents for wind, and under 5 cents for offshore. So what we are now in is a world where renewable energy is not just grid competitive, it's killing every other source of new electricity on price. Now, it's intermittent. Sun doesn't shine at night, the wind doesn't always blow. We'll get back to that. But for bulk electricity, you need some extra electricity. What's the first place you look is no longer coal, it's renewables. So let's have a look at how this plays out in some of the geographies around the world. What you'll see is very different pattern of investment, EMEA, APAC, and the Americas. And the reason is that policy matters and macroeconomics matters. All clean energy technologies, by definition, well, it's not strictly true because we have biofuels which do have feedstock costs. I was going to say, by definition, all of them are capital cost, but no fuel cost. Biofuels being an exception. What that means is they are very, very sensitive to interest rates. They're very, very sensitive to risk premia. They're very, very sensitive to policy risk premia above all else. And of course, in this room, in this audience, they're very, very sensitive to sovereign risk too. So if we look at Europe, what we saw was investment soared to around 40 billion per quarter. Europe was the first region to invest large scale in renewable energy. It helped to push those technologies down those experience curves. There's no question this was a tremendous gift to the world for Europe to take a lead like this. But you could argue that they invested too early and they used feed-in tariffs, inefficient policy mechanisms too long, and are now suffering from a lower level of investment, which is not picking up. You can see after the second financial crisis, 2011, investment dropped and has been bouncing around the sort of 15, 18, 20 billion per quarter since then. Here you've got coal use, the top 10 coal-using countries in Europe. This is climate leadership European style, where there's only one country which is really reducing coal use. And it's the dirty man of Europe, as used to be the UK. In fact, the UK, we saw, had a day without coal. This is Germany, power sector emissions. We hear all about the Energiewende. Here we are in Germany. This is supposed to be the heart, the throbbing, beating heart of climate action in Europe, and yet emissions from the power sector have been flat for nearly 20 years. Why? Because Germany has been shutting nuclear instead of coal and replacing it with renewables. And coal was supposed to be forced off the system by the EU ETS, the carbon price, and that hasn't happened yet. And this is now becoming a very pointed issue with the new government, the recent elections, and the timetable for 2020 and then 2030 targets under Paris really coming quickly down the track at Germany. That's the UK by contrast. There you can see this is the future history of coal globally. That's the Industrial Revolution. Coal use goes up. You can see the general strikes, the two spikes down, and then coal starting to be dismantled. By 2025, there'll be no more coal used in the power system in the UK at all. North America. Now, this is a strange one. Maybe you can help me here. Why does it do these strange 4-year cycles? And what could that be? Now, we all know that President Trump is trying to make America great again using the technologies of the 19th century. And the question will be, is he going to succeed? So there is coal being forced out of the electricity mix. Coal is the line at the top there, you can see. The gray one growing fast is natural gas. So that one seems to have lost its key. I'm not quite sure why, but you can see the gray fast-growing one is natural gas. The red one is nuclear. The blue one is renewables. And if you look at the changes, you look at where is that coal going, you'll see it is being beaten out of the mix by cheap natural gas, number one. Number two is renewables. And number three, I'm not sure if that's the right order, but number three is cheap energy efficiency, LED light bulbs, better appliances, and so on. The war on coal, the regulatory war on coal, is a side story compared to the underlying economics, which is about cheap natural gas, cheap renewables, and cheap energy efficiency. And there is nothing that is being done currently that will reverse that. You're not going to be able to bring back coal. And by the way, if coal demand goes up for whatever reason, whether it's domestically in the US or exports, it will bring back no coal jobs. Why? We've been hearing about autonomous vehicles, self-driving. One of the first industries that is moving to self-driving technology is the mining industry, because the vehicles are safer and because they can work 24 hours a day, because they don't need things like lights. So we also know that President Trump is going to withdraw from the climate accord. The response domestically has been this: we're still in, led by one Mike Bloomberg. And you can see whether it's businesses, cities and counties, states and tribes, colleges and universities, there's been a groundswell of support for Paris. My guess is, for both the economics of energy and for this reason, the US will meet its Paris commitments one way or another. The international response to President Trump pulling out of Paris has been, broadly speaking, this. When President Trump wants to renegotiate this thing, which is essentially a voluntary agreement, now how do you renegotiate a voluntary agreement and still have any doubt about the outcome? I don't know. Anyway, so that's probably the correct outcome. Simply to let things play out, the US will probably hit its targets, and the rest of the world shows no sign at this point of resiling from the Paris Agreement. Asia, so there you can see investment in clean energy, which really powered through the financial crises, peaked around 2015 and has dropped away. Now, why is that? First, the powering through. Well, a lot of it was China, but it wasn't just China. It was China. Then, of course, there was Fukushima, and so Japan started to invest heavily in clean energy, and India, but also Thailand, Vietnam, and other countries in Southeast Asia, in fact, all across Asia Pacific. I think that includes also Australia. So we've seen investment really grew very consistently. The peak in 2015, driven really by two countries. One is Japan, having invested so much in clean energy, having trouble integrating that into its grid. So there's been a sort of boom-bust cycle in Japan. We actually tried to warn them not to use feed-in tariffs. They ignored us and did that, so they had the usual boom-bust. And then China as well. Now, China, as you can see on the left there, the issue there is really that China's years of extraordinary growth, those years of 10%, 12% economic growth, came to an end. We're now seeing lower economic growth. And of course, that means lower growth in power demand. On the right there, you see thermal capacity utilization. As growth fell away and more renewable energy was introduced into the system, and China got back to caring about energy efficiency, what we saw is the thermal capacity factors of their power stations, or the capacity factors of thermal power stations, dropped from around 60% to less than 50%. And we also saw curtailment. These new wind and solar farms were not connected to the grid and so we're having to, or not connected or insufficiently connected, insufficient grid capacity, and therefore we're being switched off instead of producing as they should have been. And that has, of course, harmed their economic performance, and so we see lower investment at the moment. Now, China, very importantly though, is the source of the bulk of solar panels. They've been exporting very heavily. I wanted to show you this because what we see is for the last year, the majority of those solar panels being built in China are actually going to non-OECD countries. Very significant. You can see there in purple, particularly India. Right, underneath you've got Japan at the bottom, then you have Europe, US, and of course there's this trade case in the US at the moment brought by a company called Suniva against imported panels, but very interestingly what we see is China already exporting very little to the US. But the proportion going to other countries, many of the countries of very great interest to IFC, has increased and is now around 70%. India, this chap who's a great fan of solar, the cost of solar power is now cheaper than coal in this country. Is he an activist? No. This is the Minister of State for Power, Coal, New and Renewable Energy and Mines. Now, even 2 years ago, it would have been unthinkable for an energy minister in a developing world country to say that solar was cheaper than coal. The orthodoxy was that if you wanted to electrify, if you wanted to industrialize, it had to be coal. That orthodoxy was wrong 2 years ago. In fact, it was wrong already 4 years ago or 6 years ago. But now it's being acknowledged to be wrong by the people.